Hi everybody, and welcome to Readers of the Lost Art, with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is The Art of Existential Psychotherapy. Hi everybody, well, that's quite a mouthful, the art of existential psychotherapy, but I'll try and explain it as simply as I can in what follows. I'm going to look at these various different sources, so it's quite ambitious what I'm trying to do, but in keeping with the spirit of this channel, Man's Search for Meaning is a survivor's account of the German death camps by Viktor Frankl. And he went on to develop this concept of logotherapy, which is linked in many ways to this notion of existential psychotherapy that Yalom has written very persuasively about. And to illustrate some of their concepts, I'm going to look at the Divine Comedy by Dante and some absolutely beautiful illustrations. If you haven't encountered Gustave Doré before, stunning ink, purely black and white, beautifully detailed illustrations. And for people of a certain generation, if you've read a lot of the classics, Doré did things like John Milton's Paradise Lost, which I'll show you a couple of images from, lots of biblical illustrations. And sometimes I've just got these indelible images of certain ideas or parts of books that So, for example, to give you a very specific example, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Coleridge, there are beautiful illustrations that Doré did of that book, and I struggle to think of the poem without immediately seeing his illustrations. And then another camp survivor from Auschwitz was Primo Levi in his haunting memoir, If This Is a Man. And later on, he wrote another memoir, I think it was The Drowned and the Saved, and that the theme of drowning I'll pursue as we go along. And again, to back up all of these ideas, the existential art I'm going to look at of Frank Auerbach, who was a German who became a naturalized Brit. He fled as a child from Germany and spent the rest of his life in London. Then Francis Bacon, some of his haunting paintings. Jean Fautrier, who it'd be interesting if many of you have come across him, because I just think he's an absolutely stunning artist. And then the Argentinian short story writer Jorge Luis Borges, and I just like saying his name, so I'm going to get him in as many videos as possible. But old Borges, stunning writer. And I hope to encourage you to, and it's quite accessible in the sense that he nearly, I think, exclusively wrote short stories. So he's quite accessible to get into. You don't have to read huge tomes. It's not like I'm trying to persuade you to read Proust again. So just a few quotes from Viktor Frankl. And for what I take from him is this emphasis he places upon freedom and the will to meaning. So this is one excerpt. Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. So he has this theory in the book Man's Search for Meaning. He's describing how, even in circumstances like the death camps where you'd think all choice and freedom has been taken from you, he actually says certain people came into their own. And ironically, as their freedom was constrained beyond belief, they would do things like walk to their death without showing fear, almost as if to spite the guards. And he was pointing out that rather than just do everything within your power to evade death, they went to their deaths proudly and bravely, and that was the ultimate freedom. They got to choose how they died, and no one could take that from them. So that's one, obviously incredibly profound interpretation of freedom. And he goes on, any attempt to restore a man's inner strength in the camp had first to succeed in showing him some future goal. Nietzsche's words, "He who has a why to live for can bear with almost any how," could be the guiding motto for all psychotherapeutic and psychohygienic efforts regarding prisoners. And I won't try and dwell on this one particular issue, but I just think it's interesting that Frankl quotes Nietzsche, because there are various people out there who would claim his work led directly to the philosophy of the Nazis. And I just think it's interesting that someone who survived the camps has no problem with quoting Nietzsche, because I just think it's a massive red herring, blaming Nietzsche for what happened with his a misinterpretation of Übermensch, etc. But anyway, I'll try not to distract myself. And this is one of Frankl's, I'm going to talk about notions of existentialism, can't say it, existentialism, and how it can be made as a philosophy and artistic way of presenting things, how it actually has therapeutic aspects. And this is implicit in what Frankl argues about how an existential approach to life can help you orientate yourself. So in his words, the term existential may be used in three ways. Firstly, so number one, existence itself, that is, the specifically human mode of being. And number two, the meaning of existence. And number three, the striving to find concrete meaning in personal existence, that is to say, the will to meaning. So there's existence itself, the situation we find ourselves in as human beings, and I'll talk shortly about how we differ to other animals. The meaning of existence, and it's a core part of Frankl's philosophy, this idea that without meaning we're less than human. And then not just the meaning, but the striving to find concrete meaning in personal existence. So this will to meaning, there's an active pursuit. It's not a passive thing at all. And I want to really focus on this. So this concept of existential frustration is in itself neither pathological nor pathogenic. In other words, bacterial. So it's neither an underlying disease nor is it a bacterial infection. A man's concern, even his despair over the worthlessness of a life, is an existential distress, but by no means a mental disease. And to bring all this into the current cultural atmosphere we all exist in, I'm absolutely fascinated by the way Frankl talks directly about existential frustration, but he is at pains to say it's not a disease. And I suggest this has incredible relevance to today, when everything gets defined as a form of mental illness. And what Frankl, and we'll later see Irvin Yalom, are talking about is the way in which the human condition is just incredibly difficult. And they're not trying to diminish the difficulties people have, but they are pointing out that labeling everything a mental disease is often counterproductive, if not just downright inaccurate. So, I trust quite implicitly for people who've survived the death camps to have this attitude. I think we should all, take a moment. It's quite instructive. And he quotes this Edith Weisskopf Jolson, who said, "Our current mental hygiene philosophy stresses the idea that people ought to be happy, that unhappiness is a symptom of maladjustment. Such a value system might be responsible for the fact that the burden of unavoidable happiness is increased by unhappiness about being unhappy." So Edith Weisskopf Jolson here is what she's done is identify, and this would have been a good 50, 60 years ago. I think she would have written this at least. Sorry, I've forgotten the precise. This is Frankl quoting her, but I've forgotten the precise source of it. But it's I'm guessing a good 60, 70 years ago, and she's describing even then there was this excessive focus on happiness as an end in itself. And one of Frankl's insights is that happiness is a byproduct of striving for meaning. You don't directly, or you shouldn't directly search for happiness itself, because you get caught into this loop. You become unhappy because it's increased by unhappiness about being unhappy. It's this circularity that, the more you strive, the further away the thing that you're striving for becomes. And then this is beautiful. This again, Frankl quotes Spinoza in the text. But he has this beautiful phrase: emotion which is suffering ceases to be suffering as soon as we form a clear and precise picture of it. So as we go along, I'm going to be showing you plenty of images. You'll be glad to know it's not all going to be a tsunami of text. And I think there's a metaphorical and literal element to what Spinoza's saying there. If we form a clear and precise picture of it, i.e. image, that's one part of it. And artists, visual artists, do that for us. But also textual artists, great writers, provide a clear and precise picture that we process as mental images from their words. And I just think Spinoza's quote that Frankl's used here is a great summary of the power of art. This is the essence of its therapeutic content, because once you name something, I think it's the Basques have a beautiful phrase in the Basque language. They don't have a concept of territorial notions of nationality. And I think that's partly because the Basque country, insofar as it exists, is in southern France and northern Spain. So it's cross-territorial in the sense of modern definitions of nationhood. But I think euskera is the Basque language, and there's a phrase, if it can be spoken, it exists, which is a lovely idea. But also Basques have this notion that if you speak Basque, you are therefore Basque. So it's an interesting concept of the power of naming things and conceptualizing them, but also the notion of nationality and nationhood, what makes you a nation. But anyway, I'm digressing again. And this is Frankl quoting Doris Lessing. There are things which must cause you to lose your reason, or you have none to lose. So that's Lessing's quote. And then Frankl says, an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is a normal behavior, which I think is, excuse me a second. Again, I see that as having relevance to our current condition. I think the mass media or social media society we live in is, in historical terms, deeply abnormal. So you have people struggling to come to terms with it. And I think art is a great way, in various forms, of conceptualizing the abnormality of the situation we're in. So they move on quickly to Irvin Yalom's concept of existential psychotherapy. And this is what these are ideas. I'm going to focus on the first one, and in future videos I hope to get to the others. But he has this notion that existential psychotherapy is dynamic. In other words, it deals with forces. And in these four categories, these are the key elements, the key dynamic components of what existential psychotherapy is based upon. So, the notion of the dynamic is, it means there's a force involved. So with death, part of the human condition is that we're in deep denial. So, for example, I am going to live to at least 125. That's just a fact. But there's the denial that we're ever going to die. And that blatant denial that often we're all guilty of is inextricably linked with the very inevitability of the thing we're denying. So the denial strength almost gains force from the inevitability of the thing that we're seeking to evade. And that's just an existential aspect of anyone's human being's life. In order to get up in the morning, to some extent, you have to deny to yourself the fact that you're on a downward slope no matter how healthy you feel. So there's always that tension. Then similarly with the concept of freedom, this notion of it being inextricably linked to dread. In future videos, I hope to look at using various paintings. Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish existential philosopher, and he had a very complex but fascinating concept of freedom, which he links with the whole notion of anguish. Angst in Danish is this concept of when you have freedom, that's when anxiety starts. Dread comes from the freedom to make choices and the freedom to make mistakes and the freedom to sin. And then you have the third element is existential isolation. So we have a need for companionship. We have a need to make contact with other human beings. But at the same time, there's an unbridgeable gap. So I've always been fascinated. I don't know why it just sprang into my head, but you know the John Donne poem, there's a don't ask for who the bell tolls. Sorry, something about no man is an island. So in other words, no man is completely separate. We're all in it together. But then he goes on to say, but don't ask for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. So there also is this isolation that when you hear your death knell, it is definitely yours and nobody else's. So again, we're back to this, no man is an island. We're all linked as human beings, but we also experience things in a deeply isolated way. And I've been showing in recent videos the work of Edward Hopper, and he's showing, I think, this existential isolation. He's a brilliant example of that, because most of his paintings are set in urban environments where people are grouped together. But the paintings simultaneously show the isolation, the existential isolation felt by people in areas that seemingly have contact. And it's also an obvious theme of the Rear Window videos that I've done. In the midst of a crowd of people, urban centres, people are existentially lonely. And then finally, which is always an undercurrent on this channel, the issue of meaninglessness. So we are meaning-seeking creatures. That seems to be an intrinsic part of what it is to be human. But the world doesn't really seem to care. So this would, a classic example of this would be the work of Samuel Beckett and Waiting for Godot, plays like that. The idea that we're thrown into the world, and yet the world itself seems pretty indifferent to anything we do. So they're the key issues. But like I say, to focus on mostly on death. But the next images, I want to introduce you to some of the illustrations of Gustave Doré. And they also link with the concept of freedom. So these are from Milton's Paradise Lost. And on the left-hand side, you have God is signified by the light coming through the foliage. But this is when Adam and Eve have eaten of the tree of knowledge. They've eaten the apple. So now they feel shame. And up until now, if God came calling, they wouldn't have any problems at all. But all of a sudden, they're a bit shy about meeting him and guilty of their own nakedness. And then you've got the archangel acting like a nightclub bouncer. You're not welcome here. Get out. In the great nightclub of the Garden of Eden. And then you've got, I just love some of these, the detail. But this is Lucifer being thrown from heaven. And in both instances, if you think about it, so you've got human beings, the original sin, the choice to eat the apple. I think from memory in Paradise Lost, Eve is tricked by the serpent, i.e. Lucifer, into eating the apple. But then Adam is almost like this epic hero because he saying we are of one flesh, goes along and eats it too, but she was tricked. Adam, in Milton's account, wants to show solidarity with Eve, so he also eats it, but knowing it's wrong, which is that introduces the whole concept of free will, free choice, and freedom. And then in the case of Lucifer, he basically rebelled against God. So everyone will be familiar with the phrase the fallen angel, and this is a depiction of the falling. But again, it's a very human, you may think of it as evil, but it's an incredibly human aspect to rebel against authority. And then we have, so now this is Dante's Divine Comedy, the first book, Inferno. And this very famous beginning of Canto 1. Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward pathway had been lost. It's such a beautiful opening. And then I want to read for you, it's slightly lengthy, but it's going back to Irvin Yalom. And he's linking this opening scene from Dante to the concept of a midlife crisis. So midway upon the journey of our life, it's got to be artistically the best ever literary encounter with the otherwise prosaic and stereotypical notion of a midlife crisis. But I just think it's really illustrative the way Yalom takes the idea that actually it shows you it's all to do with the therapeutic content or the therapeutic uses of great art. So I would argue it massively helps. I'm trying to think, did I have a midlife crisis? I'm sure I did, but I don't drive, so I never bought a big red sports car. But that would be a classic example, typically male response to losing your potency. You go out and buy a big red phallic sports car. But it hits people in obviously different ways. But none of us escape it. You get to a certain age and you realise, and it's also delusional because most people still refer to themselves as middle-aged when they're in their 50s. So unless you plan on living to 110, you're not really middle-aged, are you? You're already further down the slippery slope than you'd like to be. But anyway, this is, from a therapeutic point of view, this is Yalom. Death cannot be ignored in an extensive venture of self-exploration, because a major task of the mature adult is to come to terms with the reality of decline and diminishment. The Divine Comedy, which Dante wrote in his late 30s, may be understood on many allegorical levels, but certainly it reflects the author's concern about his personal death. The opening verses describe the fearful confrontation with one's own mortality that frequently occurs in midlife. And then he quotes the canto. Individuals who have had significant emotional distress in their lives and whose neurotic defences have resulted in self-restriction may encounter exceptionally severe difficulty in midlife, the time when ageing and impending death must be recognised. The therapist who treats a patient in midlife must remind himself or herself that such psychopathology emanates from death anxiety. Jacques, in his essay on the midlife crisis, states this clearly. And then this is a quote from Jacques. A person who reaches midlife, either without having successfully established himself in marital and occupational life, or having established himself by means of manic activity and denial, with consequent emotional impoverishment, is badly prepared for meeting the demands of middle age and getting enjoyment out of his maturity. In such cases, the midlife crisis and the adult encounter with the conception of life to be lived in the setting of an approaching personal death will likely be experienced as a period of psychological disturbance and depressive breakdown. Or breakdown may be avoided by means of a strengthening of manic defences, with a warding off of depression and persecution about aging and death, but with an accumulation of persecutory anxiety to be faced when the inevitability of aging and death eventually demands recognition. The compulsive attempts in many men and women reaching middle age to remain young, the hypochondriacal concern over health and appearance, the emergence of sexual promiscuity in order to provide youth and potency, the hollowness and lack of genuine enjoyment of life, and the frequency of religious concern of familiar patterns. They are attempts at a race against time. I love that, the end, where he's talking about the race against time. None of us can escape it, and the ever more desperate attempt to hold off the inevitable. So the argument I'm making is this idea that someone like Dante beautifully encapsulates in an artistic form, and it's a way of sublimating the fear of a personal death by a direct confrontation with the literary representation of death on a large scale. So that was the Irvin Yalom, a personal death. And again, to repeat it, I just love this, both aspects of that. The concept of death tends to be spoken about in abstract general terms, and Yalom focuses more upon the person. He calls it a personal death. So it's back to the John Donne quote, the idea of don't ask for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. So I do think we talk in comforting terms about death in general. It's not as often we talk about my death, and we actually use the possessive form of talking about it. And this idea of the race against time. So, I was making a joke about people, men, especially male pattern bald men, even more so, buying big red sports cars. They're taking this notion of the race against time incredibly literally. So as you get into the Divine Comedy, this is, arguably the most famous quote, but above the portal of hell. I don't think you can make it out. You might just about, but on the sign, just above the entrance, abandon all hope, ye who enter here. And the test of all this is, if you're getting incredibly depressed watching this, well, both myself and, if I can put myself momentarily in his company, Dante have let you down. Because I'm suggesting that by engaging with this stuff head on, you're not endlessly delaying an encounter with the inevitable. And it's psychologically, and I think this is what Yalom and Frankl would argue, finding significance and meaning in thinking about death is ultimately much more psychologically healthy. But I thought this would act also as a tie-in with, I think it's pronounced vaguely, and apologies to any Hebrew speakers, but shuma, the idea, and it means to hear in Hebrew. But from what I can gather, it also has connotations of you don't just hear. If it's the word of God, the idea is that you also obey. So it's got definite connotations of obedience. But he uses this poem of his, Levi, at the beginning of the book, If This Is a Man. And it reads, and I just think it's the Dante Dore illustration, his illustration is appropriate here. So this is the poem, Shima. You who live safe in your warm houses, you who find, returning in the evening, hot food and friendly faces, consider if this is a man who works in the mud, who does not know peace, who fights for a scrap of bread, who dies because of a yes or a no. Consider if this is a woman without hair and without name, with no more strength to remember, her eyes empty and her womb cold, like a frog in winter. Meditate that this came about. I commend these words to you. Carve them in your hearts, at home, in the street, going to bed, rising. Repeat them to your children. Or may your house fall apart. May illness impede you. May your children turn their faces from you. And then I mentioned earlier the Drowned and the Saved, one of Levy's later works. And again, I just found this. Phlegias ferries Dante across the river Styx. You know, if we're trying to make sense of what happened in the death camps, I think resources like Dante, and if that sounds odd to you, I was going to say resources like Dante are an obvious, or can be a profound help trying to process the trauma. And I could imagine people not knowing what's to come might say, well, that's ludicrous. How could something as useless as a epic poem from the 1300s, how could that be useful at all? When in fact, as I'm about to show you, he wrote a chapter, I think it's chapter 11 of If This Is a Man, and it refers to Canto 26 of the Inferno. And this illustration is when the Roman poet Virgil is showing Dante the various rings of hell. And they're looking over, there's a flame coming up, there's a fire coming up, and the idea is that Ulysses, and I think it's Diomedes, they were opponents in the Trojan War, and they were fated to go into hell and be joined together in a flame, but they dislike each other so much, or they were sworn enemies, that the flame separates, and Dante speaks with Ulysses, and Ulysses tells Dante the story of how he persuaded his men to go on a voyage. And it's not in the original Homer the way Dante describes it, so it's Dante's used poetic license, so to speak. But Ulysses, in this Canto 26, tells Dante of how he persuades these men on this ship to go just for the sake of exploration. So it's an obvious metaphor for human reason's desire to uncover meaning. But in the case of Ulysses, he pushes reason to an unreasonable degree. But at the end of Ulysses' account, he describes how the sea just swamps the boat they're in. The waves rose over us. And this, I'm finding different ways to approach, to show the concept of how in literature, in an existential therapeutic sort of way that Yalom and Frankl would approve of, the way in which literature can actually address some of these issues in a way that would counter the midlife crisis. So there's this absolutely beautiful short story by Jorge Luis Borges, The Immortal. And I'll read quite a long segment, but why I've chosen this is because it's an amazing... the premise is, it's a document found, I think it's in the 1900s. So this is the fictional origin. And in some secondhand books, this account is found. And it's a soldier who fought for the emperor, I think it's Diocletian. And he hears of a myth of a river that gives eternal life and a tribe of immortal people. So he goes looking for it, a bit like Ulysses on a journey. And he encounters these immortals. But his encounter with the immortals isn't what he fully expected. So when he's approaching the area where he thinks they are, he's kidnapped and tied up, and he wakes up. And this is how Borges describes it. In the sand had been dug shallow holes. From those wretched holes, from the niches, emerged naked men with grey skin and neglected beards. Sounds a bit like me. I thought I recognised these men. They belong to the bestial lineage of the troglodytes, who infest the shorelines of the Persian Gulf and the grottos of Ethiopia. I was surprised neither by the fact that they did not speak, nor by seeing them devour serpents. And he goes on, so I'm splitting it up, but this is a later page. Those who have read the story of my travails attentively will recall that a man of the troglodyte tribe had followed me, as a dog might have, into the jagged shadow of the walls. When I emerged from the last cellar, I found him at the mouth of the cavern. He was lying in the sand, clumsily drawing and rubbing out a row of symbols that resembled those letters in dreams that one is just on the verge of understanding when they merge and blur. At first I thought this was some sort of barbaric writing. Then I realised that it was absurd to imagine that men who had never learned to speak should have invented writing. Nor did any one of the shapes resemble any other, a fact that ruled out, or made quite remote, the possibility that they were symbols. The man would draw them, look at them, and correct them. Then suddenly, as though his game irritated him, he would rub them out with his palm and forearm. He looked up at me, though he seemed not to recognise me. Still, so great was the relief I felt, or so great, so dreadful had my loneliness been, that I actually thought that this primitive troglodyte looking up at me from the floor of a cave had been waiting for me. The sun warmed the plain as we began our return to the village under the first stars of evening. The sand burned our feet. The troglodyte walked ahead of me. That night I resolved to teach him to recognise, perhaps even to repeat, a few words. Dogs and horses, I reflected, are able to do the first. Many birds, like the Caesar's nightingale, can do the second. However scant a man's understanding, it will always be greater than that of unreasoning beasts. The troglodyte's lowly birth and condition recalled to my memory the image of Argos, the moribund old dog of the Odyssey. So I gave him the name Argos and tried to teach it to him. Time and time again I failed. No means I employed, no severity, no obstinacy of mine availed. Motionless, his eyes dead, he seemed not even to perceive the sounds which I was attempting to imprint upon him. Though but a few paces from me, he seemed immensely distant. Lying in the sand like a small battered sphinx carved from lava, he allowed the heavens to circle in the sky above him, from the first dusky light of morning to the last dusky light of night. It seemed simply impossible that he had not grasped my intention. I recalled that it is generally believed among the Ethiopians that monkeys deliberately do not speak so that they will not be forced to work. I attributed Argos's silence to distrust or fear. From that vivid picture I passed on to others, even more extravagant. I reflected that Argos and I lived our lives in separate universes. I reflected that our perceptions were identical, but that Argos combined them differently than I, constructed them from different objects. I reflected that perhaps for him there were no objects, but rather a constant dizzying play of swift impressions. I imagined a world without memory, without time. I toyed with the possibility of a language that had no nouns, a language of impersonal verbs or indeclinable adjectives. In these reflections, many days went by, and with the days years, until one morning something very much like joy occurred. The sky rained slow, strong rain. Nights in the desert can be frigid, but that night had been like a cauldron. I dreamed that a river in Thessaly, into whose waters I had thrown back a golden fish, was coming to save me. I could hear it approaching over the red sand and the black rock. A coolness in the air and the scurrying sound of rain awakened me. I ran out naked to welcome it. The night was waning. Under the yellow clouds, the tribe, as joyously as I, was offering itself up to the vivid torrents in a kind of ecstasy. They reminded me of Corybantes possessed by the god. Argos, his eyes fixed on the Empyrean, was moaning. Streams of water rolled down his face, not just rain, but also, I later learned, tears. Argos, I cried, Argos. Then with gentle wonder, as though discovering something lost and forgotten for many years, Argos stammered out these words. Argos, Ulysses' dog. And then, without looking at me, this dog lying on the dung heap. We accept reality so readily, perhaps because we sense that nothing is real. I asked Argos how much of the Odyssey he knew. He found using Greek difficult. I had to repeat the question. Very little, he replied. Less than the meagrest rhapsode. It has been 1100 years since I last wrote it. So I just found that it's a description of the actual consequences of what if we did get to be immortal. So Homer is reduced from the genius that wrote the Odyssey and the Iliad to almost less than bestial. He's given the name of the dog by the protagonist until you get the shocking revelation that this, distraught troglodyte is actually one of the greatest epic writers humankind has ever seen. So after this, I just want to show you a couple of important quotes that come after that excerpt, because I think they're absolutely crucial for understanding the significance of what Borges is trying to say. So this is Borges in the same story, reflecting upon, I think this is the protagonist reflecting upon what's happened. Death, or reference to death, makes men precious and pathetic. Their ghostliness is touching. Any act they perform may be their last. There is no face that is not on the verge of blurring and fading away, like the faces in a dream. Everything in the world of mortals has the value of the irrecoverable and contingent. Among the immortals, on the other hand, every act, every thought is the echo of others that preceded it in the past, with no visible beginning, and the faithful presage of others that will repeat it in the future. Ad vertiginum. There is nothing that is not as though lost between indefatigable mirrors. Nothing can occur but once. Nothing is precisely in peril of being lost. The elegiac, the sombre, the ceremonial are not modes the immortals hold in reverence. So there's just a couple of phrases that I wanted to pick out. Ad vertiginum, I think is what I was trying to say as I was stuttering my way through. There is nothing that is not as though lost between indefatigable mirrors. I just think that is an amazing description of the current contemporary mass media, social media society. We're in a labyrinth, and a labyrinth is a very recurrent theme in Borges. But as though lost between indefatigable mirrors, this idea that that's what young people are encountering, in just this constant mirroring of their daily lives in these reflections of social media. And earlier on towards the top, there is no face that is not on the verge of blurring and fading away, like the faces in a dream. So that if you can please hold that phrase in your mind, because I'll be showing you some paintings imminently that I think absolutely summarize that phrase, fading away like the faces in a dream, which I'd suggest is art's way of dealing with what Borges is describing. So then he explores what it's like, the actual quality of being immortal. There is nothing very remarkable about being immortal, with the exception of mankind, or all creatures are immortal, for they know nothing of death. What is divine, terrible, and incomprehensible is to know oneself immortal. Viewed in that way, all our acts are just, though also unimportant. There are no spiritual or intellectual merits. Homer composed the Odyssey. Given infinite time with infinite circumstances and changes, it's impossible that the Odyssey should not be composed at least once. No one is someone. A single immortal man is all men. Like Cornelius Agrippa, I am God, hero, philosopher, demon, and world, which is a long-winded way of saying, I am not. So what he's actually saying there is, it maybe sound counterintuitive, but being immortal would actually stop you being human. So the one thing, to get back to Yalom's notion of existential psychotherapy, the one thing we're all absolutely terrified of, dying, is actually the very thing that makes us who we are. If you are, or if you were immortal, all your particularity, all your specialness as a person would be insignificant. Because like monkeys, infinite numbers of monkeys typing, you'll eventually produce Shakespeare, which would completely destroy the value of having had Shakespeare in the first place. So all specialness, all true creativity would disappear with immortality. So to try and put some visual bones on what I've been talking about, this is a portrait of Innocent X by Diego Velázquez. And remember the faces disappearing. And remember that phrase, death and the indefatigable mirrors of immortality. So that's a painting from 1650. And then I promise, look eventually at Francis Bacon's work. But he was hugely influenced by the Velázquez painting. But it's shocking in some ways. It's the dematerialization. You know, the solidity of Pope Innocent X in the Velázquez painting, and now almost this disappearing, this Munch-like scream in the face. What I'm arguing is I think art is representing what it feels like to be part of. In modernity, in the contemporary society we're living, obviously we're not immortal. But the way in which human culture is just reflected backwards and forwards infinitely in this labyrinth of indefatigable mirrors creates this sense of insubstantiality that great artists like Bacon are reflecting back. All the solidity of the original Pope Innocent X in that painting has completely gone. Then you have Jean Fautrier, who I would be interested in how many of you have ever encountered him before. But he was painting, he had a studio apparently outside Paris, and in the woods the Nazis would torture people, resistance fighters and so on. And I don't know how true it is, but the story is that at times he could hear the screaming from the tortured people. So this was influencing, you know, how could it not? This was influencing the paintings he made. And otage in French means hostage. So he did a series. This was what made him... I don't think he ever achieved massive fame in his own lifetime. And even today, for example, I don't think in the US, United States art market, he's particularly well, you know, thought of, or that particularly well known relatively. But insofar as he was well known, the Otage series, Otage I should say, is it's the series that got him some recognition. So tête d'otage, the head of a hostage. And we'll see it with reference to Auerbach in a minute, but this, he developed his own technique, Fautrier, of, it's not, strictly speaking, I don't think, impasto is the phrase used for the really thick layered application. So the paint comes off the canvas in, you know, huge depth. Well, I think he actually developed his own technique that went even beyond that. So he'd used scrunched up paper and almost paper mache type quality, as well as oils. And there's, I think I've read somewhere someone compared or said there's a sense of cave paintings almost to Fautrier's work. And if you think that's fanciful, this is just a detail. And I encourage you to actually, I haven't got time to go into it again, maybe in another video. I'm absolutely intrigued and fascinated by cave paintings. But this is detail of, it's called the, there's almost like a prehistoric Paleolithic gallery in an underground cave. Chauvet Pont d'Arc in Ardèche, and these are the lions' heads, and this was a otage fond noir, hostages on a dark background. And I hope you'd agree, it's almost a similar technique. But then a future topic will be, remember this concept I quoted from the Borges, the disappearing faces? And this is impasto. This is, you know, buttered on with a, sorry, it's almost like with a butter knife, the thickness of the paint that's being used. But the disappearing nature of the face. And you can see the texture going off the side of the canvas, the frame. But I'm not normally a massive fan of abstractish, you know, art, but there's something about Auerbach I find absolutely stunning. And arguably, I'd be interested to know what you think in the comments, but I find Auerbach, the last few paintings have all been by Auerbach, but they're not as nihilistic as Francis Bacon's paintings. And I encourage you, I'll do a whole session on Francis Bacon. But the anguish and the angst and the disappearing faces that Bacon paints do seem much darker. Even though I don't know, these may not seem light to many people, but I just think there's something more life-affirming in Auerbach's paintings. Despite they might superficially be a bit depressing, but it never has that effect on me, whereas the Bacon, much more so. But not, you know, actual Bacon cheers me up immensely, but you know what I mean. But the way in which he gets the tension between, you know, very, very abstract, but the face simultaneously almost receding and emerging at the same time. So as I said, I encourage you to try and check out Frank Auerbach's work. I think it's stunning. But I'll finish today with a couple of paintings by Van Gogh. So the first one, this is the chestnut tree, the blossoming chestnut tree. And the second one, the final picture you'll see, is the blossoming chestnut branches. But what I'd like to do is read to you a short excerpt from going back to Viktor Frankl and Man's Search for Meaning. And I just think it's one of the most profound practical illustrations of existential psychotherapy in action. So this is Frankl. He's talking about an image that comes to one's mind, like the story of the young woman whose death I witnessed in a concentration camp. It is a simple story. There is little to tell, and it may sound as if I had invented it, but to me it seems like a poem. This young woman knew that she would die in the next few days, but when I talked to her, she was cheerful in spite of this knowledge. I'm grateful that fate has hit me so hard, she told me. In my former life, I was spoiled and did not take spiritual accomplishments seriously. Pointing through the window of the hut, she said, "This tree here is the only friend I have in my loneliness." Through that window, she could see just one branch of a chestnut tree, and on the branch were 2 blossoms. I often talk to this tree, she said to me. I was startled and didn't quite know how to take her words. Was she delirious? Did she have occasional hallucinations? Anxiously, I asked her if the tree replied. Yes. What did it say to her? She answered, it said to me, I am here. I am here. I am life. Eternal life.